So almost immediately after the end of World War II, we had the beginnings of what we call the Cold War. And the Cold War was a period where basically the Soviet and United States were kind of vying for influence around the globe. And it's called the Cold War because luckily it never came to direct fighting between the United States and the Soviets. But when we look at the outcome of World War II, over 60 million people died in World War II, and the highest numbers of those casualties were in the Soviet Union and China. And in the settlements at the end of World War II and after World War II, basically the agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union was that territories that had been liberated by the Soviet Union would stay under their influence, and territories that had been liberated by the US and Britain and France would kind of stay under their influence. So what this created was this division that ran almost right down the middle of Europe, because most of Eastern Europe had been liberated by the Soviet Union and it would stay under their influence. Most of Western Europe had been liberated by the United States, Britain, and France, and so it's going to stay under their influence. They also agreed to basically divide Germany between an eastern half and a western half. And technically, the western half was subdivided into three zones at first between the US, Britain, and France. Later, they would unite those three into a single West Germany. Other territories were also divided. Korea, for example, was divided between a northern communist half and a southern capitalist half that was supported by the United States. And so it created this, what Winston Churchill called this Iron Curtain that divided Europe. And it ran almost right down the middle of Europe, and everything east of that curtain was mostly communist governments propped up by the Soviet Union. So the Truman Doctrine really outlined the US and their stance towards communism for the duration of the entire Cold War. Technically, what the Truman Doctrine did was it gave aid to Greece and Turkey. Greece and Turkey were in danger of collapsing after World War II. Their economies were struggling, and so it pumped hundreds of millions of dollars into their economies to get them going again. And ultimately, what it did was protected capitalism in those two countries, because had they fallen, it would have been very easy for communism to take over. But on a larger scale, what the Truman Doctrine established was a US policy of containment. Basically, that wherever communism threatened other nations, the US would be there to stop it. And that was kind of the US policy for the duration of the entire Cold War. The Marshall Plan pumped billions of dollars, $12 billion to be more precise, into Western European economies. So again, after World War II, these economies were devastated. And so the Marshall Plan pumped money into those economies, and it was extremely successful. Within a few years, most of these Western European economies were producing at levels equal to what they had been before World War II. It also became very clear relatively quickly that the West was doing far better compared to Eastern Europe. We're also going to see the creation of these military alliances. NATO was an alliance between the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. And on a larger scale, it was a promise by the United States that they weren't going to back out and go back to a policy of isolationism the way they did after World War I, that they would be there to aid Western Europe for the long haul. In reaction to the creation of NATO, the Soviets are going to form a similar alliance made up of communist nations. And so most of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union were part of the Warsaw Pact. We're also going to see the creation of the United Nations. The United Nations was created to replace the ineffective League of Nations. And it created a stronger version of the League of Nations. And the idea behind the United Nations was to create this global entity that could help prevent wars and help solve global problems.